Welcome to the Tolkien Collector's Guide YouTube channel, where we gather experts from around the world to discuss Tolkien's books and the people who read them. I'm Urulókë, and with me are Trotter and Mr. Underhill.
Okay, so today we're talking about how to identify printings in, well, books in general, but Tolkien books specifically. We're also going to be talking about how to maybe properly use the term printing versus edition. One of the things that I know that collectors see a lot online is people using the term edition when they really mean print, or people using the term print when they really mean edition. So that's one of the things that we want to talk about today as well. Tolkien publishing, as y'all know, is it can be very confusing from the different publishers that were utilized between Houghton Mifflin and Ballantine, Allen and Unwin, and then HarperCollins, Unwin Hyman, all the different Tolkien publishers. So there's a lot of different copyright pages that have been used over the years. And so that can lead to a lot of confusion in terms of what edition do I have of this particular Tolkien book? What printing do I have? There's a lot of different ways to identify. One example, an early example, is The Hobbit. Allen and Unwin, for those early editions of The Hobbit, they used sort of like a top-down indication as to, they would show you The Hobbit was first published in 1937, and then they would, for each subsequent printing, they would give you the year, and they would tell you which one. So that's one example. Another example would be the third edition of The Hobbit that was printed by Houghton Mifflin in the 1960s. This one's really easy. It just says the copyright information, and then it tells you flat out which printing this is. Like it says the 25th printing or the 18th printing. Those are really easy. But it got a little complicated after, because they switched to the number line, which people who don't know what to look for know. They wouldn't know which number meant what. That's another question that we get a lot, I know, is which number means what. Another example would be what Houghton Mifflin used in the late 1970s into the 1980s. They would say this is the first American edition, and then they would give you a bunch of copyright information, and they'd give you a number line. And sometimes there'd be a letter in the number line, sometimes there wouldn't be. So that's another example that can be confusing. That, like, this is a first edition, but it may not be a first printing. And then another good example would be the number line that HarperCollins used, in which they still use to a certain degree, but they started using in the 1990s, is they would give you a number line, but the numbers are out of order. Like it would go 1 at one end, 2 at the other end, and then 3, 5, and so on and so forth. So that can be confusing to people as well. And then another thing that I'd like to talk to y'all about is book club editions. How book club editions, a lot of times they won't even tell you what printing this is. They'll just give you some sort of copyright information. And there are some editions, there are some ways to tell, but some editions it's almost impossible to tell which printing it is. And so it can be very confusing, but I think the three of us here today, we can kind of cut through some of that confusion. So what do y'all think about some of that stuff?
I'm always very grateful that I collect UK editions, because, quite frankly, it's much easier with those than it appears to be with the US editions. However, even saying that, though, it's not always that simple. If you take an example like the Two Towers, if you look at the first edition, the Two Towers, the second printing says second impression 1955, and the third impression says second impression 1955. In it. And the only way you can tell the difference is on the previous page there's a 1955 or there isn't one. Now, so it's not quite the case, but it's normally that for UK editions you have, as Chad said earlier, if you take The Hobbit, you've got first printing 1937, second edition 1930, second impression 1937, third impression 1942, and this just goes down and down and down and down, until, unfortunately, the printers got fed up with this and decided to reset the whole page. And that's normally when it goes wrong as well at this point, because they can't work out what the next one is, and they manage to get the previous ones wrong. But on the whole, that's nice and simple way to do it. And then, of course, you get number lines, which are, once people understand how number lines work, they're actually quite good. If you don't know how they work, though, they don't really mean anything. You just look at them and you're completely confused. But I think if we start off with, say, it's a question here for chat. If you have a 1938 US Hobbit, how can you tell what impression it is?
So if you have a 1938, the easiest way to tell if you have a first print or not is the title page. Actually, the first prints of the 1938 U.S. Hobbit have the Bowing Hobbit on the title page, and the later printings, the later, well, there's sort of a debate, not a debate, but there are variants. Are they later printings or are they variants? It's kind of difficult even for someone like me to tell. But the easiest way is the first prints have the Bowing Hobbit. The subsequent variants have a different logo. It's sort of like a I can't remember off the top of my head.
It's a flute.
Yeah, it's a flute player. That's right. So that's the easiest way to tell. It's much harder to there if you have a later variant. There are things you can look for which can be confusing. You can look at like the binding. You can look at some of the errors in the text. You can look at some of the illustrations. But so those are Andrew picked a really difficult one to start us off with. Those are really difficult to tell which one is which. They can be.
Well, in order for me to tell which one I have, I've got a third state. You actually have to do quite a bit of research to work out which one is. You have to look at various pages in the book and see whether they've changed, whether various errors have been changed and things on those lines. So you cannot tell from just looking at the title, at the copyright page, because it just says printed in 1938. And that's all it says on there. So you have to look at other things. And but there are ways to find out what these other things are. TolkienBooks.us has those. There's articles in the Tolkien Collector. You can always go on to Tolkien Guide and ask there. Well, I put a picture of your book and ask.
Absolutely.
What about
ways to do it?
Jeremy? This is something you could talk about. What about the early U.S. Lord of the Rings? Talk about some of the problems with those.
A favorite topic of mine. One of my areas of collecting. The Lord of the Rings, the first edition hardcovers were published by Houghton Mifflin in the United States, but the sheets, the pieces of paper in the book, were imported from the British publisher, and so they would get the sheets came in from the UK. They would replace the title page only, which has the copyright information on the verso, on the reverse of it, and then bind those in the blue cloth and publish those. And so
I always like the fact they leave the adverts in the back for George Allen and Unwin.
That's
for all
right.
The offices. I didn't take that out.
Those are great. Exactly. Those are great.
So the British sheets, the copyright page, as Chad mentioned, and Andrew, you as well, would go through and list each impression, first, second, third, as they were made. When Houghton Mifflin got them and replaced the copyright page, they didn't put impression information on the reverse. So there's, at least not for the first 9 or 10 impressions or so. When
not till like the 1960s for the most part.
So when you're looking at early Lord of the Rings, Fellowship, Two Towers, Return of the King from Houghton Mifflin, the early first edition impressions, they don't have any or print information called out. And so it's the detective work, as we were talking about just a little while ago, where you have to look for indicators like which publishing houses are listed in the back of the book, and which does the copyright page have the date on it, because only the first impressions of each of the 3 volumes had that date on it. And then as you get deeper to try and identify which impressions, you're looking for broken text, like a word that has a little notch carved out of an O on one of the pages in the book. There's a lot of detective work that we were just talking with Alan Reynolds about this in a recent video with him. It's very fascinating because he had enough of the Lord of the Rings British editions that by comparing the U.S. impressions with the British ones and figuring out which small indicators of changes, broken text or edited changes where words were changed during the impressions, you could align the U.S. impressions with the British ones and figure out which one's which. So there are very informative articles in Wayne Hammond and Christina Scull's The Tolkien Collector. It's a small, privately published magazine that they've put out. I think the issues were like 20, 21, and 22, if I'm remembering correctly. They go through
Yep, that's
Fellowship,
right.
Two Towers,
Yeah.
and Return of the King. So if you have one of those copies,
It was Stephen Frisbee
he was
who
author.
wrote that. Stephen Frisbee's article.
So if you have a copy of a first edition of the books and it doesn't have a number line, because as Chad mentioned, later on in the 60s, they started putting the impression number in the book. So you can tell the later ones. But for the earlier ones, you just have to open the book, open Stephen Frisbee's article, and follow the checklist in order to identify which printing that you have.
Mm-hmm.
It's a lot of fun little detective work to do, but it does make it very challenging to identify which printings you've got. Thankfully, for the most part, for the U.S. editions, there's a lot of value in the first impressions, which have the date on the copyright page or on the title page at the bottom. It'll say 1954, 1955. If that date's missing, there's not going to be a huge variation in value as far as which impressions you've got. It's a lot of fun to dig it out, but they're all reasonably equivalent, I would say.
One of the more complicated things that about identifying which edition you have, which printing you have, can be within the Tolkien books realm, is if you have a book, say something like Tales from the Perilous Realm, or if you have like a poems and stories sort of, which for those of you that may not know, that's a bunch of Tolkien shorter works that have been compiled together in one single volume. And so a lot of times that can be confusing for people because they may see the year that this tale was originally published and think that that's the year that the book came out. Or for another example, like say an early version of Tales from the Perilous Realm was Poems and Stories, right? Which I think Allen and Unwin, the first edition of that is 1980. Poems and Stories is 1980.
Yep.
So we could do.
And so, but then HarperCollins released a sort of like an updated edition in the early 90s. But if you look at that, which I have in my article and I'm on Hen, I have a picture of that. If you look at the copyright page, it says published in the UK in 1980, but then it says, copyright HarperCollins 1992. So that can be confusing for people as well. Is this book from 1980? Is it from 1992? So I guess, what are y'all's recommendations to kind of help people work through some kind of stuff like that?
Often, I think it's fairly safe to say that the last date in there, it's not going to be before that. I've seen before where people have looked at something and said, "Oh, it's got copyright 1968 in it," and then it says underneath, it says 1990 appears underneath. Well, it's not going to be a 1968 book if it says that in there. So you're normally, a rule of thumb is going to be the last date in it's got to be at least that or after it. But it is quite a challenge sometimes to tell what book it applies to on a copyright page if they're listing other works on there as well, to know which one you're actually looking at.
Yeah, and it can also start you on down the collecting path too, because you could look at these other works on your copyright page and you can say, well, I don't have those. I really like this volume. Maybe I can go and find some of these other volumes.
Yeah.
It's always a good thing.
Yeah, books that are compilations of various other works have incredibly complicated copyright pages because they have to list the copyrights for all the materials that is reproduced in there. You'll even see some interesting examples where if like a quote from another author is used as a header, or a song lyric or something like that appears, obviously not very often in Tolkien books, but just in general, those also have to have a copyright stated in the publishing information for the book. So it's not necessarily straightforward to figure out exactly what you're looking at. I think Andrew's rule of, if a year appears on that page, the book is at least that age, because there are no 1960s books
it's a good
year
rule.
1990. It just doesn't happen. So if 1990 appears, the book is at least in 1990 or later.
Another thing that can be confusing, I guess, for people is if, like, for example, Houghton Mifflin went through a phase, and I think Unwin Hyman may have gone through this as well, where they give you the edition. They say this is a first edition, but then they won't give you any indication as to what printing it is, or they'll give you some information. It may have a year in it, but it's hard to tell which printing it is. And so I thought maybe we could talk a little bit about what are some of the criteria generally that book collectors use to sort of define what's a new edition, and what, how do we go from being a first edition to moving into being a second edition? I know that can be sort of like controversial too.
A new edition is normally a substantial change in the book.
Aha. Substantial, very subjective.
Substantial. It's not the same. It's not the case of there was a spelling mistake in the book and that was corrected. That would not be a new edition. That's just the next impression. A substantial change, though, would be, for instance, in The Hobbit, where half a chapter's rewritten. So that's where
that one's pretty obvious. One. Yeah.
In the Lord of the Rings, where there is an issue over someone actually printing a copy of the book when you're not wanting them to do that, so you have to rewrite it to get your copyright back again. And that's the difference between the first and the second edition. But that's actually quite an interesting one, because it's not a really substantial change in the book between the first and second edition. It's more the appendices and the foreword is different. And there's an index, for instance. Would you normally count, say, having an index in a book as being a new edition, or having a new foreword being a new edition? But in that case, this one was. This was.
What about something like letters? I know Wayne and Christina went and did a lot of work with the index for the letters for Tolkien, and I've never seen that one described as a new edition of letters.
There's only one edition.
It's just like a corrected edition. So it's interesting. Sort of like the terms that we assign.
As collectors, we tend to use the word edition, I think, more loosely than this definition, and the definition is correct. But if we're talking about, hey, do you have the edition of The Lord of the Rings with John Howe's cover art? That is a visual difference. That when we say edition, we're just talking about the packaging of the book, but there's no textual difference. That's not an actual technical new edition. It's just a repackaging for marketing purposes of the second edition, in this case, of the text.
So should we really be using the word print instead of edition? Like, hey, do you have the print with John Howe's artwork on the dust jacket?
No, because the copyright page uses the word edition, so we should still carry on using that. The copyright pages are very much focused around editions as well as impressions or printings. Printing and impression technically are very similar. There may be some difference. I'm not really aware of the difference between printing and impression. But certainly edition is used. And if you look at the copyright page, you'll normally see the word edition mentioned.
Yeah, there was a lot of chatter, too, this last year about the new pictures by Tolkien and whether that was a new edition. It's technically it's not a new edition because none of the text is different. But there are some different, there's different packaging. There's the image quality has been sort of rehashed. And so there was some conversation just this last year about pictures and whether that was a third
even
edition.
HarperCollins themselves will call like the deluxe illustrated edition of The Lord of the Rings, right? The red one you can see up behind me here. They call it the illustrated edition. So the word is being used even by publishers, etc., as a variation in the full package of the book. I keep using the word package. I'm trying to think of a better word, but the packaging of it versus the form of the text that's inside it. I think we kind of use edition to mean either or, but it's important to know, if you want to know what words you're reading, that edition is what's defined by the copyright page and the form of the text, and if it's been changed by the author. And then the packaging edition is sort of a looser use of the word, just to mean how it looks on the shelf.
It's also worth pointing out that editions tend to really refer to the very first printing of the book. A lot of collectors are always absolutely want to have the very first printing of the first edition of the book. And all these other ones don't really count as first printings of the first edition, even though they are different illustrators, different covers. They don't count as that.
Book dealers will quite often use first edition as shorthand to mean first edition, first printing, or first impression. That's something else we should mention is impression and printing are pretty much interchangeable. I think it's more of an American versus British usage of the words. But so book dealers, when you see a book listing either online or in a published catalog and it says first edition, they mean it's a first impression or a first printing of the first edition. And they will only mention the impression or printing if it's a later one. So it's not necessary to ask them, is this a first impression of the book that you have listed? Because that's pretty much a given in bookstore listings.
Yes, and always ask for pictures of the copyright page. If there's any sort of, if the dealer won't give you a picture of the copyright page, you need to cut bait, because that means they probably are not, they're probably not being honest with you. Okay, so then I guess the kind of the last thing I wanted to talk about is book club editions. These can be even more difficult to determine which printing you have. Like, for example, a lot of 1980s, 1990s Tolkien books that are book club editions, there's all kinds of different ways to identify whether you have a book club edition and not a trade edition. But it can be really difficult to identify which printing you have, because for the most part, from what I've seen, book club editions don't give us any indication. There's no number line. There's no top down. There's not really much to tell us for us to go on. So I guess what I'm asking y'all is, how should people go about determining, or can they even determine if they have a certain printing of a book club edition?
I think the primary question is, do I have a book club? Because stating up front, book club editions, other than to the hyper fixated collector, tend not to have any value. There's extremely few book club editions which are relevant in the collecting world, in the sense that they are, I can't think of any for Tolkien, but there's some other authors where the first hardcover.
There are for Tolkien.
The first hardcover edition is
the UK ones. Yeah, the first hardback UK editions are book club editions.
So those can be very interesting to collect, and I think have value on the secondary market. But being able to tell, like, do I have a book club edition? Looking for price, number line. Sometimes they'll state book club edition. Sometimes they'll have little notches, like the little blank impressions in the backboard. There'll be like a little square or circle that's dented into the back. And sometimes it's just a quality difference. Like they'll have paper boards instead of cloth covered boards, or their quality is lower. And but once
a lot of them won't have the price on there either.
That's right. Exactly. It's very rare to have the price.
So I've always been curious. Do y'all know the answer why book club editions typically don't have a price listed on there? Is it because they're sold for less?
No, I suspect it's the publishers don't like them putting don't like them having the price on there. In the UK, they didn't have the price because you couldn't buy them in shops. You could only get them by the post. In which case, you don't need the price on the book because you buy it from a catalogue. But some book club editions do have the price. The Foyles Hobbits, the one with the nice orange covered 1942 Hobbit, does have the price on it, and it's in massive big letters, and it really annoyed the publisher because it was a third of the price of the ordinary book, and they couldn't sell any ordinary books until the labels.
Foils a book.
Well,
they sold those in shops. Yeah, they sold those in shops as well.
That's what I was going to say. The foils one was actually for
Tolkien loved that dust jacket too.
What's the foil shop?
But once you know you have a book club, there's little hints that you can look for as to which version you might have. Looking for codes on the bottom of certain pages. Some of them mention where they're printed, some don't. Some say the word book club edition on the dust jacket, some are blank. So there's fun little details that you can dig through to try and identify which one you have, to figure that out. And that's one of the little rabbit holes you can easily get lost in, having fun with. But the instant it's a book club edition, its value is pretty much set. It's very hard to say one printing of a book club edition is worth more or less than another one.
Yeah, there's all kinds of ways and it's fun to, like Jeremy said, it's fun to go with different types of Tolkien books and to identify whether they're trade or whether they're book club. Like, for example, a really easy way to identify whether the second edition Houghton Mifflin Lord of the Rings box set, the black box, or the red box, a really quick way to identify whether you're looking at a book club set or a trade set is the trade set or the book club sets have a small 4-digit number right below there's a sticker on the box, the Lord of the Rings sticker, and the book club has a small 4-digit number right underneath the title, but the trades don't. So when you're looking at listings, that's a really quick way to identify whether it's a book club or whether it's a trade. So there's lots of little nuances like Jeremy just said like that. And it's fun for us collectors, I think, to go through and try to find that
obviously
stuff.
there's things like they're different heights and things as well, aren't they, sometimes the books.
Yeah.
So they again, I think that was to try and save money. So they don't tend to be bigger; they tend to be smaller book club ones because it's a money saving exercise.
So on the whole, book club editions are lower quality than trade editions, but just as a general rule.
Not always, but as a general rule. If I go back to the foils one, they're exactly the same. Though actually, that one is cheaper because there's no maps in it. Even though it says in the book that go look at the map, there isn't a map. But
go look at the maps. Wait, what?
There isn't one. There aren't any maps.
So like I said, there's identifying Tolkien prints and editions can be very confusing. It can kind of be overwhelming at times. But for anybody who's watching the video, I would say if you're at all confused, come onto the guide, and somebody will be there to help you out.
I think, I'm sure we've got the expertise to try and help with that, and that's a great place to ask questions like that about different editions.
Great, thanks, Chad. I had a lot of fun chatting about this topic.